let's talk about diplomacy between World War I and World War II, that is interwar diplomacy. And to begin with, we have to go back to the Treaty of Versailles and how the Treaty of Versailles set Europe up, how it created a new political situation and a new economic situation and a new diplomatic situation within Europe proper. Some of the problems that occurred in post-Versailles Europe, some of which were caused by the treaty and some of which were either direct or peripheral results of the treaty, is first and foremost a new sense of nationalism. Now, we have not discussed nationalism in any great depth, but the kind of nationalism that arose in Europe was, in the wake of Versailles, was for those new European nations something of a joyous and expansive nationalism. But it was also tough. It was tough for these new nations, particularly small ones that had been carved out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and out of the Ottoman Empire, to assert their nationhood. So there was a certain level of aggression with that nationality and that nationalism as well. And for older nations, those larger nations like Germany and France and Italy, those nations felt a fearful nationalism, a defensive stance that cried out for not only protecting the homeland, but asserting the prerogatives of the homeland, both domestically and foreign affairs, in an effort to forestall any aggressive action by any other nation. So you have a pretty volatile mix of nationalisms in Europe, pushed forward by new nations as well as by the defensiveness of older nations. Now, as a direct consequence of the Treaty of Versailles, the German economy was also crippled. Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles, called the German War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept full guilt for World War I, which made them open to having to pay reparations to other nations that signed that treaty, the Treaty of Versailles. And these reparations, as we've talked about before, could only be paid in gold or in industrial products. And this was a serious problem for the German economy. And I want to bring this up because in just a moment, we will talk about various kinds of plans that particularly the Americans brought forward to try to ameliorate these problems. Finally, as far as Italy was concerned, there was a bitter feeling that they had been cheated out of the territory of Fiume, which is on the Dalmatian coast. Trieste was an area that could go to the Balkans or could be Italian, and the treaty gave it to the Balkans, gave it to what would become Yugoslavia. And so the Italians felt like they had been duped and cheated. Now, let's talk a little bit about diplomacy being led primarily by the United States toward peace. An effort to control armaments and efforts to control reparations, and even in 1928 to outlaw war, or at least an agreement to outlaw war. Prior to, I'm sorry, just after the end of World War I, the United States, England, and to some extent France were concerned about the territorial ambitions of Japan. And so they brought Japan into the Washington Conference of 1921-22. This conference began in Washington, D.C. in November of 21 and lasted until February of 22. And the big players were, of course, the U.S., England, France, and Japan. And this was a naval arms conference. Three treaties emerged from this conference. The first, signed in December, and then not fully signed, not fully ratified until 1923, was the so-called Four-Power Treaty of the Washington Conference. Now, the Four-Power Treaty had all the signatories agree to maintain the territorial status quo in all nations of the Pacific and to agree to consultation and arbitration in the event of any kind of territorial alteration or any kind of altercation among the signatories. That is, they would agree to sit down. The next treaty that came out was the Washington Naval Treaty, also known as the Five-Power Treaty, that limited battleships to a ratio of 5 British battleships to 5 U.S. battleships to 3 Japanese battleships. Also, battleships could not be any larger than 35,000 tons. Battleships were the premier weapon of World War I and immediately thereafter. They were the most, for Japan, they were certainly the most aggressive weapon because Japan's army was relatively small. And so Japan focused on its navy, at least during World War I and in the immediate aftermath of World War I. And as Japan was beginning to expand its navy, the Americans and British in particular, and the French had a great stake in this too because they had colonized Vietnam, then they really feared that the Japanese had territorial designs on the Western Pacific Rim, that is what we would consider East Asia. And so the Washington Naval Treaty, the Five-Power Treaty, limited the number of these battleships that each nation could have. France was figured into this too. It could have 1.7 battleships to the 553 limits on British, US, and Japan. Then the Nine-Power Treaty, negotiated in late January of 1922, recreated the open door to China. And this is the first time that the U.S. ever got any actual agreement among signatories to their open door policy in China. So the Washington Conference tried to establish consultation for territorial change, limit the number of battleships that nations could possess, and create an open door in China. Now, later on, we'll come back to this because the Japanese always considered the Washington Conference to be a slap in the face. And this is one of the reasons that Tojo was able to push the Japanese toward war against the United States. Other conferences slightly later attempted to ameliorate the reparations issue concerning Germany. The first of these, called the Dawes Plan of 1924, after Charles G. Dawes, the vice president under Calvin Coolidge, who won a Nobel Peace Prize for this plan, for promoting this plan, pushed forward his plan the year after Adolf Hitler had done his beer hall putsch, his attempted coup d'etat in Bavaria in an attempt to revolutionize the Weimar Republic, that is, create a fascist state out of the Weimar Republic. that failed. We'll talk about it in a minute. But at the same time, the Germans defaulted in 1923, and so the French occupied the Ruhr Valley, which is all wrapped up in this beer hall push business. So Charles Dawes proposed that the signatory powers talk about reparations. He reorganized the State Bank of Germany in the Dawes Plan. He was able to secure a foreign loan of 800 million gold marks to Germany, and he got the signatory powers to Versailles to agree on expanded sources for reparation funds. That is, they expanded the base of what they would accept in reparations, France and England primarily. It wasn't any longer limited to gold and silver. Now you might say, well, what do you mean a foreign loan to Germany of 800 million gold marks? Where was that money going to go? It was going to go to pay off the arrears so that Germany would not be in default, and so the French would be forced to leave the Ruhr Valley, which they did in 1925. So this is money coming from French, English, and American bankers to Germany to pay off Americans and Germans, and Americans and English and French. Yeah, I know. The next of these amelioration treaties was at Locarno, which guaranteed Germany's western border until 1925. After the Treaty of Versailles, the western border of Germany was not decided upon. Would it include any of Alsace and Lorraine? Would it include all of Alsace and Lorraine? Would the French establish an ongoing protectorate over the Saar Valley, which was on the other side of the Rhine from France? How much territory would actually be in Germany and how much would be in France? This was decided at Locarno. Locarno established the principle of arbitration of disputes rather than unilateral action, and this was in direct contravention and spoke directly to the French invasion of the Ruhr in 1923. So Locarno created for Europe this idea in diplomacy that arbitration, taking it to a third party whose decision would be binding on both parties, was better than just invading another country. This was called, this really did lighten up the mood in Europe quite a bit. And consequently, we hear about the so-called spirit of Locarno, this attempt to really create a mechanism by which war can be avoided by countries who are having contretemps with one another. And that spirit of Locarno would be appealed to. I'm sorry for using passive voice. European diplomats would appeal to that spirit of Locarno into 1939 as they tried to keep the peace in Europe. The next of these treaties, the Kellogg-Briand Treaty of 1928, began the planning for an updated version of the Dawes Plan, and also it outlawed war. 50 nations signed this treaty, and every nation who signed it said, well, what do I have to lose? I don't necessarily feel bound by this treaty, but this was definitely not only in the spirit of Locarno, but in the spirit of the extraordinary pacifism of this era. There really were only a few bellicose people in Germany or Italy. Most people of the Western world were pacific. They did not want war. World War I had shocked them. They called it the war to end all wars. Now, we know now that it was not. But at that moment in time, it was very difficult to push forward the idea that there would ever be war again. It had just become too costly. And so the Secretary of State under Coolidge, Kellogg, and the Premier of France, Briand, negotiated a treaty and then invited other other powers to sign the treaty, and 50 of them did. The most important part, and the longest lasting, I guess, part of the Kellogg-Briand Treaty was that it established the mechanism by which this last plan would come about, the so-called Young Plan. Again, an American began negotiating with Germany, France, and England in an attempt to cancel outright the remaining German war debt. What Young was able to get was a significant reduction in the reparations. About 90% of the reparations were just wiped off the books. And the Young Plan set up a bank for international settlements, a financing mechanism by which Germany could, and other countries could pay off their reparations. This has to do with financial history, and it has to do with financial machinations. But by 1929, it was pretty obvious that there had to be fund transfers between countries. And this Bank for International Settlements became the linchpin in these fund transfers for political reasons like reparations, loan payments, things like that. It would become the basis of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which we'll talk about when we talk about war aims of World War II. Germany not only got a significant reduction of debt, but in addition to the Dawes Plan of 1924, which engineered a loan, this Bank for International Settlements engineered a major loan as well, and Germany made its final payment to these financiers of their war debt on October 3rd, 2010. That was a big deal in the news on October 3rd, 2010, October 4th, 2010. Germany made its last payment for the money that it had borrowed to pay off its reparations. Okay. The U.S. during this period of time sought to avoid war, particularly after 1930, and really after 1933. We'll talk in just a moment in the next lecture about the rise of fascism in Europe, particularly the rise of Nazism in Germany, which after 1933 set the ball in motion toward World War II very obviously. And the U.S., much like England and even France, was in a grip of pacifism. The people simply did not want to go to war, and they did what they could to avoid going to war. Congress in the U.S. in particular was very much against going to war, and they weren't just pacifist, they were actually isolationist. So as war began to gin up, began to come into the horizon, and the first act of World War II in Europe was the Spanish Civil War of 1936. But as it became more and more obvious that something was going to happen, then the U.S. Congress passed in 1935 the so-called Neutrality Act of 1935 that limited the sale of war material to any belligerent country. Just a blanket statement. We're not selling anything that can be used for war to any belligerent country. This act, in a political compromise, was 1 year long. In 1936, it had to be re-upped, and so Congress passed it anew in 1936. This forbade arms sales to any belligerent country. In 1937, after the Spanish Civil War began, and after Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union sent war material and in some cases troops, and as individuals from other countries, including the United States, went to Spain to fight in the Civil War, then the American Congress passed the Neutrality Act of 1937, which forbade Americans from traveling on ships of belligerent countries. Remember the Lusitania? Well, they did too. And they said, well, we're not going to try to keep an open seas. We're just going to get our people off of these ships. And it defined civil war as belligerence. That is, it didn't have to be a war between two distinct countries. A civil war, meaning the Spanish Civil War, was also by Congress defined as belligerence, and so these acts applied to Spain and everybody involved in Spain. Now, in 1939, they passed the last of the Neutrality Acts that restricted arms sales, but allowed what we called cash and carry. This was one of those weird political compromises in which the isolationists who did not want to sell any war material to anybody realized that they had to compromise with interventionists like Franklin Roosevelt, who wanted to make sure that England was supplied with at least civilian goods. And so the Congress passed what came to be called the cash and carry system, enshrined in the Neutrality Act of 1939, which said that if a belligerent nation wanted to buy U.S. goods for its civilian population, then it could come and pick up those goods if it paid cash for them and if it transported those goods itself. So if a country had a merchant marine and enough ready cash, it could buy things. Well, the only country that this really applied to was England. And we made great use of the cash and carry business to fortify England in its fight against Germany until we actually entered World War II. Another great push, not so much diplomatic as popular, to avoid war after things really broke down in the late 1930s, is the so-called American First Committee. The American First Committee developed among some students at Yale in 1940, and it brought in both very conservative isolationists like Charles Lindbergh and Eddie Rickenbacker, as well as very liberal and even leftist pacifists like Norman Thomas, who had taken over from Eugene Debs as the head of the Socialist Party. It tended to overwhelm the left wing of the pacifist movement, and the left wing of the pacifist movement and the right wing of the pacifist movement were different. They approached the problem differently. The American First Committee became further and further and further right. It became more and more and more conservative, which leaned toward isolationism rather than pacifism. America First didn't have any problem with war for the most part. What they had a problem with was engaging in a foreign war, particularly a war in Europe. They were headquartered in Chicago, and they are believed to be the largest single anti-war movement in U.S. history, larger even than, if you count membership in the organization, it's larger even than the student movement in the 1960s and early 70s. Charles Lindbergh was probably the most prominent speaker of the America First Committee, and Lindbergh tended to be a little on the pro-Nazi side. He had his problems with with Jews and with England and with the way Germany had been treated, and he appreciated the strongman tactic of Adolf Hitler. But after America was attacked by Japan on December 7th, 1941 at Pearl Harbor, then the America First Committee disbanded itself. It disbanded on December 11th, 1941. Okay, so diplomacy in the interwar years began with a recreation of how the Treaty of Versailles had set up politics and diplomacy. Then we looked at interwar diplomacy toward peace, the Washington Conference, the Dawes Plan, the Treaty of Locarno, Kellogg-Briand, and the Young Plan. And then we looked at how the U.S., during particularly the 1930s, tried to avoid bringing its engaging in warfare. Of course, that was all tossed out the window with the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And with that, I end this lecture, and as always, thank you very much.